So anyway, today I've been asked to talk about choline and methionine transition cows. Early in my career, I did a lot of work on choline, and then after maybe about 10 years or so, I got into other things. And primarily the reason for that was at the time I was working on it, there was no rumen protected choline. That technology just was not here. And so when you have to do everything using post-rumen infusions, and you're basically the only one in the lab that can figure out how to get a tube through a rumen cannula down into the abomasum because your arm is long enough, and your students just pretty quickly say, you know what, I need to do something different. And so that's kind of what happened. So let's get started. So some of the material is going to be, I would say, either a repeat or a review. I'll try not to dwell on that. But when I was getting ready for this talk, the first thing I thought is, oh my God, what am I going to talk about? And then I called Rick, and he gave me some ideas and some things to work with. And on Monday this week, I was like, I'm in trouble here. And then by midweek, Clay called me, and I said, it's going to be okay. I'll be all right. So what I want to talk about first is energy mobilization. Early in my career, I focused on that, actually did some measurements. And so the question that's here is energy mobilization. Is it good? Is it bad? Or is it really just flat out normal? And I think you can probably tell by the way I spoke to that, it's really the latter. So I'll start off, first of all, every mammalian species does this. First of all, during pregnancy, they're going to lay down fat, and not just fat, but also protein, and they're going to store that during the pregnancy period. And at the same time, that just doesn't stay around. So once the animal calves or goes through parturition, that fat, that body energy, that fat and protein is going to be mobilized, and it's there for a purpose. It's there to serve as a nutrient source for producing milk. So and there's no animal species, no mammals that I know of that don't go through that process one way or another. So the other thing you'll see, and this is pretty much true across species also, is at parturition or at calving, food intake is either reduced or, in some examples, non-existent. So because of that, and because of the demands for lactation, the animal is going to use body tissues as a source of nutrients in order to support milk production and support of the neonates. And as an example, nursing women are expected to mobilize somewhere between 18,000 to 27,000 calories of body tissue to support lactation. It works out to roughly 100 to 150 calories per day. And if the lactation period, let's say they nurse for 6 months, you're looking at roughly the caloric equivalent from body tissue of somewhere between 2,000 calories a day, and that's a requirement, 9 to 15 days of their total energy requirements. That's a normal thing. A lactating cow easily can lose 50 to 75 kilograms of body weight during the transition period. And I will say right now, the body weight that you measure on a cow that occurs during transition is not totally reflective of the amount of body tissue that's mobilized. And why is that so? Because as the cows start eating more feed, they have more gut fill, and a good thumb rule is for every kilogram increase in dry matter intake, you can expect about 5 kilograms increase in gut fill. And if you've ever worked with fish-related cows in early and late lactation, those cows in early lactation, you open the cannula, they're stuffed. You can't even get a hand in there. Whereas you go on a cow late lactation, no problem. There's dead space above the rumen gill. And it's not just the rumen, it's also in other parts of the intestine, particularly large intestine and cecum. Now, there are some extreme examples. Did I skip one? Okay. I'll use this one. So, the grizzly bear, they basically lactate. First of all, they go through parturition and then, of course, initiate lactation while they're still hibernating. So the cubs that are born, they weigh less than a pound. All right. The sow, or mom, she's still hibernating. Somehow the cubs figure out how to find the nipple on the sow, and they nurse during the latter part of the hibernation period. Okay, and they will grow. So they start off at about a pound, and depending on the species and the size of the bear, they'll grow to anywhere from 10 to 20 pounds at the time that the sow awakens from hibernation and moves out of the den. And so during that time period, if the sow is sleeping, she's not eating, okay, and she's supporting not only her own maintenance requirements, admittedly at a much reduced level because of the hibernation process itself, but she's also mobilizing tissue to produce milk for her cubs, such that at the time she awakens, forgive me, she awakens hungry as a bear. Okay, so bad too. But anyway, if you look at a picture of sow when she just comes out of hibernation, they're basically skin and bones. So in this instance, this mobilization is a very normal thing. Okay, what about lactating cows? I actually, Rick, this is one of your former students. This was not a study dealing with nutrition. It was a dry cow study looking at effects of different dry period lengths on subsequent production of cows and also energy mobilization. And in this study, there were 3 treatments. Cows either had no dry period, they had a shortened dry period of 28 days, and then finally they had a 56-day dry period, the normal length for dry period. And what's shown here is the dry matter intake of these cows over the periparturient period, going from the end of lactation, or in the case of the cows with no dry period, no basically continuous lactation, to cows with the solid circles. These are cows that had a standard 56-day dry period. And the thing I want you to remember from this, or take away from this, at least in cows that have a dry period, this energy mobilization starts not after calving, but actually before calving. Because the cows, you see a reduction in feed intake that occurs, and that occurs before the animal calves. So you have mobilization of tissue occurring not only after calving, but also prior to calving. Okay, so what happens during that time period? You've seen this kind of data before. You see an increase in blood NEFA levels. Typically, you also see an increase in blood beta-hydroxybutyrate levels, or ketones. And when that happens, and if it's to a high enough extent, you start seeing accumulation of liver fat. And all this shows is a comparison of the liver fat content prior to calving, and then these are from 28, 56-day animals, and then after calving for cows that either had no dry period, a shortened or a normal dry period, and they all will accumulate fat. And then as the animals proceed postpartum, at least in the animals that had normal dry period, that liver fat will disappear. So how much gets mobilized? Well, in this example, this was almost 20 years ago, we were interested in looking at the amount of lactate in mature lactating cows, going from the dry period and where we took our measurements were in 2 weeks prior to estimated calving date, then at 5 weeks postpartum, and then at 12 weeks postpartum. And we fed cows 2 different diets. One that had 16% protein and the other that had 19% protein. And we reasoned, our thinking was at the time, and we were right about that, was that cows that were fed higher protein diets would mobilize more body fat and more body protein. And you notice, if you look at the protein mobilization, the numbers are nearly identical. The amounts of body fat, protein that were mobilized in both groups were 21 kilograms, 95 minus 74. And the diet really didn't have an effect on protein mobilization. The amounts of body fat in the cows that were fed the low protein diet, they started at 143, and by 12 weeks postpartum, they're down to 83 kilograms. They mobilized about 60 kilos. The cows fed the high protein diet, they mobilized not 63, but more like 83 kilograms, although there was no differences in body protein mobilization. So the bottom line is that cows mobilize a lot of fat, but it's not just fat, it's also protein that goes along with it. And the other thing I'll point out is cows that were fed the 19% protein diet, they averaged 3 kilograms more milk, but they ate no more meat. Okay, so all of the extra energy when essentially all the extra milk really was coming from more mobilization of body tissue. So how much protein is mobilized? Well, first thing I'm going to tell you right now is when you look at, on average, what the composition of a kilogram of body tissue that's mobilized, basically about 60% or 600 grams is fat. So it's going to, along with that, you're going to get about 80 grams of protein, and the remainder is water and ash that's mobilized. You say, well, why isn't it just all fat? Why don't, they need the protein, they don't want to mobilize that. That's not the way it works. If you ever go on a diet, one of the very common things that you'll see, in fact, it's very normal, if you go on a diet and reduce calorie intake and you start losing weight, everybody thinks that, oh, I'm just losing the fat. No, you're not. You're probably losing about that same proportion, about 600 grams of fat, and you're also going to lose some muscle mass. And you say, well, why would you mobilize ash? Well, part of the reason you have the ash, this is from bone, okay? And you remember what happens to astronauts when they go into space? They lose muscle mass and they lose bone mass. And the reason they lose bone mass is because they don't have to fight gravity, therefore they don't need to have as much bone mineralization, and so they go together. And the same thing happens to people when you lose weight, and it happens to all other animals also. So remember I said about 21 kilograms of protein was lost. Well, part of that is the fact that you have this calf. There's probably about 8 kilos of protein associated with a calf. Then there's another, probably, and I'm guessing here, about 2 kilograms of uterine tissue that's lost. Remember, the cow when she calves, her uterus is huge. And you have the amniotic, the placenta, amniotic, and that kind of thing. So you probably have another 2 kilos there. And then, but she still loses probably about 10 to 11 kilograms, and that is available for milk protein. All right, what about fat? All right, so 60 to 80 kilograms. The majority of that is maternal, okay? And if I was going to cite one factor that influences the amount, and this is what we actually found in that study, was fat cows mobilize more fat than thin cows. And this is where this idea of they need to be a certain body condition score, and now as we're saying, the thing is thinner is better because they mobilize less fat. that's true, but on the other side, there's less fat that's available for producing milk. Okay? And rarely, I will tell you right now, is that increasing dietary energy rarely has enough impact on energy balance in the cow. What happens is if the cow eats more, she puts more in the milk tank. And if she eats less, it's probably not going to have a big impact on her energy balance. It's just going to make less milk. And so essentially what I'm telling you is that any extra energy that you get by improving energy intake in that cow during the transition period is probably not going to result in improvement of the energy status or make the cow have a less negative energy balance. And so I guess the bottom line is I will tell you the transition cow is metabolically set up to mobilize body tissue. All right? And so my bottom line is body tissue mobilization is expected and quite honestly is really perfectly normal. It's not an abnormal situation at all. But still, there are limits. All right, Kevin showed this slide, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. So when you mobilize adipose tissue in the cow, you release non-steroidized fatty acids, and they have to be processed. And so what Chris Reynolds did here again was just simply estimated how much NEFA in the liver really have to take care of relative to days postpartum. And you notice again that it increases during the late pregnancy period, peaks early, and then gradually declines as cows move away from parturition. Okay, so what happens? Well, there's really two things that can happen. One is the NEFA. The higher the NEFA levels, the more the liver takes up. And so it's absorbed by the liver. And there's really two things that can happen. Either the NEFA can go to the mitochondria, it can be oxidized there and used as an energy source by the cow. But there's only so much that the cow's liver can handle. And normally a cow, that's not the primary area where energy production occurs. Okay? And so some of that is simply incompletely oxidized. And when that happens, the NEFA are converted into ketones or beta-hydroxybutyrate and other ketone bodies. And essentially the liver is overwhelmed, you get ketosis, and all the things that go along with it. So that's one thing. So if they can't oxidize it, the other option is let's re-esterify it, let's process it, and send it out in the form of VLDL. If you're not familiar with that term, doctors call VLDL bad cholesterol. That's the stuff you take for, essentially, if you take a statin drug, they're trying to get rid of the VLDL. Okay? And so in order to do that, the liver has to essentially proliferate triglycerides. They have to be combined with phospholipids and apoproteins, as Heather talked about. And the other thing which is required is choline for the phospholipids. And if there's not enough of those, choline to reduce the LDL, it accumulates in the fat, and that's why you get fatty liver. If it is released, especially in the early postpartum cow, of those, the mammary gland is the place where almost all of this is going to be utilized. It has a priority for the nutrients. You'll have some end up in adipose, but not very much, because the cow is not set up to store lipid at that time. The cow is set up to utilize that extra lipid, and where it typically ends up is in milk fat. Okay, so it gets exported, and then it goes to the mammary gland. So here we're in we're in the mammary epithelial cell, and the mammary epithelial cell can utilize fatty acids from NEFA if they're bound to albumin, and it can use that to make milk fat, or it can take fatty acids from the diet, which will be packaged as chylomicrons, or if the NEFA goes through the liver, it'll come as VLDL, and it can take these up and incorporate those into milk fat, such that the final milk fat globule or the final milk fat that's produced by the cow, more than half of that either comes from fatty acids that come from the diet, or, as in the case of the early lactation cow, fatty acids that were mobilized from body fat. And Rich showed some actually very interesting, very common studies. If you take a cow and you put a cow on a starvation diet, what will happen is milk fat will increase. Okay? And in fact, an old trick was that when they used to conduct what we call these 2-day or 1-day tests, where the milk texture would come down or come to the farm, collect milk, and they want to maximize the output of fat because they were interested in butter. So the herdsmen, what they would do is just before the milk tester came, they would cut the cow's grain allocation. All right, they put them on a restricted diet. Lo and behold, milk fat came up. The tester was there only a short period of time. It was just a short enough period where milk didn't start declining, and they got one step, and they got an increase in milk fat. So when you mobilize fat, it's very common to see an increase in milk fat. Okay, now choline and methionine. So a little background here. Choline was actually discovered by the same scientists at the University of Toronto by the name of Manting and Best, who discovered insulin. And when they were working with these diabetic dogs, what they found is another result of insulin deficiency was these dogs had fatty liver. And when they fed these dogs that were insulin deprived, they fed them either raw pancreas or lecithin, phosphatidylcholine. They could essentially eliminate fatty liver. And so a classic choline deficiency is an increase in fatty liver, and they found that basically feeding choline or feeding protein would protect against fatty liver, and the primary source or the primary type of choline that you'll find in circulation is phosphatidylcholine, which is basically 2 fatty acids, a glycerol background, phosphate, and then choline will go in the intake. So choline and methionine were found to be called lipotropic agents. And what that means is basically they eliminate fatty liver. Now there are a bunch of lipotropic agents that one can include in the diet, and 3 of them I'll list here. There's actually another one, tetrahydrocholate acid, methyl tetrahydrocholate. But you'll notice that all of them have a methyl group, and these methyl groups are labile. And as Heather pointed out, the methyl group in methionine, that is a methyl group that can be utilized in a variety of different metabolic pathways and synthetic pathways. But they all have methyl. And the other thing you remember is that choline has 3 times the methyl that methionine has. Okay, so why choline in transition cows? Well, transition cows mobilize lots of fat, both pre and post calving. They're susceptible to ketosis, which is basically a failure to oxidize the mobilized NEFA. They can get fatty liver, which is a classic choline deficiency symptom. And so therefore, if one was going to project any place where choline is going to work in a lactating cow, it would be during this transition period, where that would be the time to see either choline or other electrotropic agents like methionine. Okay, so do choline and methionine interact in lactating cows? And the answer is yes, they do. And this was a very simple experiment. Well, it wasn't that simple. Because when we did this experiment, it was time, there was no rumen-detected choline. There really weren't any rumen-detected methionine products that were commercially available at the time. So all of our studies involved post-ruminal infusion, which basically requires a rumen-fish-laying cow and the ability to essentially thread a piece of Tygon tubing through the rumen, find the rumen omasal orifice, and then further pass that down into the abomasum. So this is a small study, and the study was designed as follows. We had two treatments. We had either 30 grams of choline per day, this was choline chloride, or 45.6 grams of methionine. This was on an equivalent basis, so equal moles of choline versus equal moles of methionine. All right. Then on top of that treatment, we used what's an inhibitor of the transfer of methyl groups from methionine for synthesis of choline, and we used a compound called 1-amino-2-methyl propanol, or AMP, which basically blocks that step. So the first part of the experiment, there was no AMP that was utilized. And we got some small responses to the use of choline in terms of milk fat content, and also milk protein yield, okay, and FCM. But when we added AMP, which basically blocked using methionine for producing choline, you see that we got a much larger difference in milk production, fat content, and also in FCM production. And basically all that told us was, if you block the use of methionine for choline synthesis, that essentially the cow relies on it and tells us the cow is using methionine basically to produce choline. Okay, so in terms of the results of this experiment, basically compared to methionine alone, there was a fat, protein, FCM response to choline. Blocking met use or methionine use for choline synthesis essentially enhanced the response for choline, and finally it said a significant portion of methionine methyl is being used for choline synthesis. That's all we really know. The other thing, and one more thing, when we initially set this experiment up, we were going to try to infuse equal amounts of choline methyl as compared, methionine methyl as compared to choline. When we did that, the cows stopped eating. Okay, it was like, I'd start the experiment, I get a call from the farm that said, cows didn't eat. What's going on here? Well, maybe something happened, so we tried again. The cows stopped eating. Then I went back to my nutrition, and I learned that basically methionine is toxic, and especially about 2 times the requirement level. And so, if you think that you can add methionine on an equal methyl basis, like let's say if you're feeding 15 grams of choline, you're talking about a lot of methionine, and it's not going to work. So I think again about that, because basically on a weight basis, it takes about 4 times the amount of methionine. So be careful. You can't simply replace it 1-to-1. All right, so what about using methionine or protein in transition cows? Well, you need to remember methionine has 2 roles, dual roles. One, it's a precursor for milk protein synthesis. And in a lot of the diets we've seen, methionine is first limiting, and when you add methionine, rumen-containing methionine to the diet, you get a milk production response. The other thing it's used for is a methyl donor, all right? And it's a methyl donor pretty clearly for choline synthesis. And the reason we know that is dietary choline is pretty much degraded in the rumen. In fact, we did experiments early on where we looked at the flow of choline to the rumen, where we found massive amounts of choline in the diet, unprotected. Okay, and we found up to 300 grams of added choline as choline chloride. We got maybe 1 or 2 grams of extra choline that reached the small intestine. And so, for all intents and purposes, and if you look at feed choline, the same is true. The cow really doesn't get choline from the diet unless it's coming in a rumen protected form. All right. If you look at requirements, and this is a slide actually Rick gave me, in terms of feeding cows and looking at the amounts of rumen potential deficiencies in metabolized protein, you'll see that on paper, based on what the cow is eating and the amount of milk protein she's producing, there's a big deficit. And theoretically, if you feed a diet, a higher protein diet, or you feed a diet either 17 or 15.7% protein, the higher producing cow is going to have a greater deficit. Now, what happens when you feed protected amino acids? So this is an Illinois study published in 2013. They had 2 treatments, a control, or when they had fed either Metasmart or Smartine from day 21 to day 30 postpartum. This is the feed intake data. The study was designed to maintain at least a lysine-methionine ratio of no more than 2.8 to 1. And they had the dark circle control, the open was the Metasmart, and the diamonds, or the triangles, was Smartine. They got a feed intake response, particularly after about a week postpartum. And they get a response to production to amino acids? Absolutely. And this is not uncommon. You see this over and over again. In the right circumstances, you will see a response. And here the response was roughly about 3 to 4 or 5 kilograms per day. And that response actually began roughly about a week postpartum. So they responded milk-wise. Okay. What about on the methyl donor side? Well, here the picture is, let me finish this. So anyway, in terms of production response, there was an 8-pound response in milk production. They got a response in milk protein concentration. They got about 125 grams of extra milk protein and about a 9-pound per day increase in energy corrected milk. So the cows responded. And anybody who would dispute that, they will respond, no question about it. Okay? What about on the metabolic side? So here what I've done is basically average across the 2 protein treatments, or the amino acid treatments, and look at the blood levels of NEFA, which they measure several times, the beta-hydroxybutyrate levels, and then the liver total lipid and the triglycerides in the liver. There essentially was no response in terms of NEFA or DHB. And you might actually say, well, but they gave more milk, so maybe just not getting an increase was a positive thing. And you can argue that. In terms of total lipid, there was a small change in total lipid concentration and also in triglycerides, but neither was significant. But as Rick pointed out, most of these transition cows, they simply don't have enough animals to really pick up differences like that. You have to have big differences. So I'll let that go. Then if you look at other experiments, and this is just a synopsis of studies that began in Mike Socha's thesis, where he had methionine and smartine from minus 14 to 105 days postpartum. They sampled at week 1 and 3. They looked at the liver triglyceride levels, total lipid levels. There was no change in lipid at either time. Wasn't significant. Did they get a production response? Absolutely. Prenat et al. 2010 had Nephron at 0 and 9 or 0 and 18 grams per day. Sampled at 2, 4, and 16 weeks postpartum. the mean over 16 weeks was 1.8 versus 2.6. That was significant, but I think actually going in the wrong direction. Was there a production response? Absolutely. Later, one lower and control, MetaSmart, or 0.0% SmartMean. Time frame, -10, they sampled at -10 prior to calving, 7 to 21 days. The liver triglyceride levels at 7 days postpartum, no difference. There was a slight decrease. Later on, was it significant? No. Did they get a production run? Absolutely. Okay. Then some others, I'm not going to go through that. There was one study by Brink looking at using 0, 25, or 40 grams a day of HME, and they did get a response. It was a quadratic response at what time? 21 days postpartum, but it wasn't significant. As a production response, yes. And then pilot study by Burdick et al. This was using feed restriction. And here there was no change in liver triglycerides, but there was no production response. So the evidence as far as the metabolites, in terms of NEFAs, PhD, liver fat, it's mixed, to say the least. Okay, so why no response from liver fat when using methionine? Well, you have to remember, they have two roles. Methionine is a precursor for milk protein, and it is also a methyl node. I have to believe, or at least I think, that during the early lactation period, the priority is for using methionine as a precursor, an amino acid precursor, for milk protein production. And basically what happens is it drives milk. So you have a higher priority for use as the higher priority for milk use as compared to as a methyl node. The other deals with potency. And basically, if what you're trying to make is choline, phosphatidylcholine in the liver, it's going to take 4 times as much methionine to make 1 unit of choline, and so you have a difference of scale. In addition, they have to generate a carbon chain for choline, and then there's some evidence that basically phosphatidylcholine from methionine probably is less effective, certainly on a weight basis, than VLDL synthesis. So that may explain the difference. So summary of protein responses. Many experiments will show a milk production, a milk protein response to supplemental methionine. There are much fewer experiments that show an improvement in liver function, as measured either by liver fat or Lundy or BHDA. All right, what about choline? All right, so the first experiment that I saw using choline was actually one that Rick Farmer did in his lab. And basically it was done using feed restriction in pregnant dry cows. And they had 2 central models in this study. In the first model, what they had, essentially, all the cows were fed a normal diet during a pre-treatment period. They measured the liver fat content or triglyceride content during the pre-treatment. And then all the cows went on restricted feeding with or without rumen-protected choline. And as expected, when you restricted feed cows, she goes into negative energy balance, NEFAs go up, and liver fat went up. When they used rumen-protected choline, the increase in liver fat was roughly about half that as it was without the choline added. On the other side, they said, okay, let's get cows and let them have fatty liver to begin with. So during a pre-treatment period, they restricted fed cows, and then after that, they put them on normal diet, and then fed either 0, a control, or rumen-protected choline. These values are the pre-treatment values for both the control and the rumen-protected cows. And you notice that the cows that were on the choline, just by chance, remember they're all on the same diet, had a much higher level of NEFA. And then these data are covariate adjusted data that were adjusted for pre-treatment levels. And by day 16, you see that the rumen protected choline cows, they had cleared that liver fat quite a bit faster. So what did that show? What? Choline is effective in terms of preventing the accumulation if the animal's going to negative energy balance. And secondly, if the cows already have liver fat accumulation, it will enhance the removal. All right, so another study. This is a little more recent by Zahn, published in 2011. There were 38 cows in the study. They fed 15 grams of rumen protected choline over the transition period. And what's shown here are the liver triglyceride levels as a percentage of wet tissue. And so here, these are liver fat levels prior to parturition in weeks, then at 1 week, 4 weeks, and 6 weeks postpartum. But the cows that were fed the rumen protected choline, the dark bars, they had lower liver triglyceride levels. At 6 weeks, basically all the cows were about the same. And basically all it showed was that essentially during that early period that choline was effective in reducing liver fat accumulation. Over time, basically all the cows are eventually going to eliminate that. So basically, what about the effects on DHEA? Well, there were none. Okay, so here you're not seeing any effects on NEFA. The author suggested that choline, essentially, the way it worked was to increase liver VLDL export and prevent the evacuation of triglycerides in liver during that first week after calving. So, in terms of choline and fatty liver, I would say the evidence is stronger for protective effect of choline based on feed restriction studies that were done at Wisconsin or more recent lactation studies. What cows would I expect to benefit more likely to benefit? Well, remember I told you fatter cows mobilize more body fat than thinner cows. So the high BCS cows are calving. And then, but what causes that? Well, those high BCS cows are simply cows with extended lactation and long dry periods. Okay, so in summary, I'll wrap it up. In terms of comparing choline versus methionine, first thing is all cows mobilize fat protein, just like any other animal. If you add protein, it definitely will increase milk. It increases, in many instances, energy mobilization, especially in fat cows. There's not much evidence that methionine prevents fatty liver, okay, but it definitely increases milk. And the reason that there's not a lot of evidence, at least I think, is basically, I think it's really the priority for use is for milk protein synthesis rather than as a methyl. Choline, well, that will decrease liver fat for sure. Reduction responses, Rick's going to talk about that next, so I'll leave that to him. So that's basically my bottom line. But in terms of metabolic and what's going on, if you need choline for the LDL synthesis, probably better off just eating the choline. And with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
Questions for Dr. Erdman?
First, I'm Pedro, I'm a student from Brazil. First one, congratulations for your research. And I want to know if the methionine and choline that you give to the animal in the rumen, they are lost in the process, or they're used to produce other amino acids, and what are their levels in the rumen?
Okay, so the question was, what happens to choline methionine in a rumen? All Right. So with choline, if you put, let's say, choline chloride in the rumen, basically the first step in terms of degradation is you make trimethylamine and acetaldehyde. The methyl groups in the choline, they will eventually end up as methane. Okay, and in fact, there's some evidence that a significant portion of the methane that's produced in ruminant animals is produced from things like methionine or other compounds like choline that have methyl groups, and bacteria are extremely efficient at basically breaking down choline. So, in terms of, the amount of choline that reaches small intestines, it's basically nil. Methionine, it depends on the form it's fed in, whether it's going to come from unprotected rumen undegradable protein, or if it's in the form of a rumen protected amino acid, rumen protected methionine, you're going to get that. So methionine is much less variable. Our experience is it doesn't really matter what the source of choline is, whether it's in the feed or in a supplement, and it's not protected from rumen degradation, it's going to be destroyed. So the ruminant animals see very low choline reaching the small intestine. So they really rely on the methyl donors like methionine as a way to synthesize the choline that they need. Bottom line, very low in this. Yeah.
Rich, has anybody shown in the ruminant model that choline truly enhances VLDL secretion? Has that ever been shown, experimentally?
I'm not aware of it. Heather, are you aware? She's here. I'm not aware.
Because a lot of that data is from laboratory animals, guinea pig and rat.
And there was a very small experiment, as I recall, that was published as French work, where they infused methionine in the portal vein, and they were able to demonstrate increased export of triglycerides from the liver. That's all I remember. Are you aware of any experiments where they've actually looked at? Do you know, Heather?
What was the question? Sorry.
Right. The question was: is there any research in ruminants that shows enhanced VLDL production when you supplement with choline?
Not directly in ruminants. Most of them look at, like we've been talking about, decrease in the liver lipids and assuming that that's through VLDL, but not directly. There's some in the non-ruminant literature, but not in ruminants.
So we don't know for sure if the mechanism is the same.
Absolutely not. Or at least I'm aware.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Rich.
You're welcome.